And yeah, I think what we are going to do now is, why don't I start on this one, Matt, after you run the numbers, and I'll kind of
Okay.
set the stage, so to speak, whet the appetite, if we will.
There we go. So
what are our
this is
numbers?
the Smiths' debut album, The Smiths, coming in at number 22 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums. It's the highest ranked album that we're covering tonight. Number 3 in 1984, number 190 of all time, and it is the Smiths' second highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. And the Smiths comes in at a number 12 ranking in overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums. And this album is not in Rolling Stone's top 500 list.
Okay. Well, it's funny because there are some bands that I have traditionally been big fans of that like we didn't cover for a while, and then they're like all hitting all at once, right? Like boom, 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 and then there's some coming up in a couple weeks that are continuing ones that are in my all-time favorite list. So the Smiths are such an interesting band from an album perspective because like half of their content is on albums and half of their content is on like compilations or B-sides, right? So figuring out, what your favorite Smith songs on is not as easy as, for me at least, it's not like, oh, it's that album, right? Because their stuff is spread over studio albums and also, compilations, right? Like B-sides or Louder Than Bombs or Hatful of Hollow, all these different things.
And singles too, right?
Right, singles, and they have like the U.S. and the U.K. versions sometimes have tracks from these albums. Like I know Hatful of Hollow, I think had like Hand in Glove and This Charming Man, right, were on there, but also with songs that aren't on this. Like I think Ask is on there, which I don't think is, if I remember correctly, I don't think Ask is on any album, but it's in sort of this general area. So, and like, Panic, is later. There's just a whole bunch of different songs, like, and we'll talk about that later because I think we have Louder Than Bombs on there, which may be our only compilation. We did an EP last week and we're going to do a compilation later. But this album's always been an interesting one for me because I feel like the Smiths haven't fully gotten their optimum sound at this point, but there's so many things in it that give you an idea of what makes them, in my opinion, a really great band. Because to me, the dominating narratives of the Smiths have kind of been, Morrissey's lyrics and sort of persona, right, which is like backwards looking, vintage Hollywood, old poets, sort of like old curmudgeonly soul, but literary. The guy who was the Velvet Underground fan club president. And then you've got like Johnny Marr, like guitar virtuoso, super young, with that ringing, Birds style guitar, sound, jangly all over, that's the thing. The thing that doesn't get talked about, I think, is Andy Rourke and Mike Joyce, who are really, really good rhythm players, no matter what Morrissey said in his book or down the road, where they kind of like wrote these guys off as like, I think Morrissey called them like session players, which is kind of ridiculous because, we'll do it later, but there's like songs like Barbarism, Barbarism and stuff like that are just incredible, like bass songs. And so you put them all together, and I think that's a little bit of what's going on here. I will say that of the Smiths albums, I think that this one is the least consistent. I think the highs are really high. I mean, most people who are loosely aware of the Smiths, I think, probably would have a little bit of an idea of Hand in Glove or This Charming Man. I think those are probably the two songs that are most known. I've also always loved Reel Around the Fountain and Pretty Girls Make Graves. There's actually a band that's named after Pretty Girls Make Graves, too, that I enjoy as well. But then there's some other songs. There's Morrissey still is sort of doing the yelping version, which is the one version. I tend to be a fan of Morrissey's vocal stylings. I know he's not for everybody, but I do the sort of the wailing, like sort of falsetto moan is not my favorite version of Morrissey, but he's already sort of displaying the witticisms, the literary references, and also the willing to do subject matter, like, the Moors murders, right? And like Suffer Little Children and stuff like that. I mean, there's a lot of songs that sort of allude to the, I guess you'd say, ambiguous sexuality as well. Like from the beginning, he's an androgynous presence. And yeah, the Smiths are interesting because they're very much an 80s band, but they're also a backwards looking band, whether you want to go into like the jangle of the Byrds or, some of the Velvet Underground influence or vintage Hollywood. There's a lot of that in there, but they also sound like, guitar driven indie rock that comes later in the decade and, continues through the 80s and 90s and 00s when, they were a commonly name-checked band. I think it goes without saying, and we'll talk about it, that like the Smiths connects with their audience as strongly as almost any band I've seen, because when you encounter them, right, like they speak to you in like, especially in like adolescence, in a way that, and that's where I first encountered the Smiths too. And it's very interesting because like I did not have that disconnected narrative, right, or sort of, the stuff where like you feel like Morrissey speaking to you with Johnny Marr's guitar like lining it behind, but that didn't mean that it didn't resonate with me as sort of like an observer who appreciated those moments, right, when you were there. And I talked about that with The Cure a little bit, a band that has not an insignificant amount of similarities to the Smiths, but in this one, I would say thumbs up on this one, but I don't consider this to be peak Smiths because there are songs that don't speak to me as much. But the highs, like, the two singles, This Charming Man and Hand in Glove, and the interesting nature of the lyrical content and the choices by Morrissey. And like I said, the very, very underrated rhythm section of the Smiths that only gets better down the road, are all on display here. And it feels like we are in the mid 90s, and this is the first vestiges also of feeling like the 90s and the 00s, right, in terms, to me, of the guitar sound, I think. So that's kind of where I stand on this one. Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, and they're a band too that really wasn't around that long in the big scheme of things as a band.
83 to 87, right?
Yeah, so so the the ratio of quality to quantity is pretty high.
And they got big quickly, by the way, from when they formed to when they hit in England,
Yeah. And either of you guys can answer this, but I was thinking about this. How popular were they when they were, around, and were they more popular in Britain than in the U.S.?
Well, they were a massive band in Great Britain, and I think in America they were like an indie band that amongst fans of rock, right, or college rock, or they were a present. They weren't like an anonymous band, but they certainly weren't getting play on rock radio, right? And they didn't really even have like an MTV presence, and that's because I think there's a Britishness to them that at that time, I think, kind of, didn't allow them to cross over. It's kind of crazy that they didn't cross over because other bands in their lane, like REM and The Cure and U2 and all kinds of different bands, right? Like, had crossover success. And certainly later, they became a massively influential band. But, even then, you don't really hear the Smiths on the radio, even to this day, when you think about it, because they never found a lane in classic rock radio or anything. So does that answer your question a little bit, Josh? Because
I think so. It's curious because they would be a band that somebody might name check, but not really be familiar with for as popular or as kind of influential as they are, I guess, is like, I think there's kind of
there's
no great...
a lot of bands like that in the 80s. Yeah, like The Replacements, Sonic Youth, those are all like name-checked bands that, they had some crossover success, but not major, right? Like they kind of just,
and I've listened to all of or most of their albums, I think, at one point or another, and the appeal for me and the appeal on this album is definitely Morrissey's voice. I like his kind of crooner style. I think it's unique to the time and kind of unique. There's not really any other person that I can think of that kind of sings like he does, along with Johnny Marr's guitar, which is, really great and carries over, to Radiohead and his film score work, which I'm a big fan of, and things like that. And the lyrics too, that you made the point of, his kind of influence in poetry and stuff, and I can hear that when listening to this album. And when I look at the lyrics, when I'm listening to the songs, you can you get the feel for the poetry more than some of the artists that we have listened to recently. I like the retro feel to them too. You said they were looking backwards. I can get that. There's definitely like, especially we're such in an era right now where it's very synth dominant in a lot of the albums we listen to, and they pretty much rejected that completely. So that's kind of a fresh
yeah, they never really
respite.
do introduce synths. Yeah, they're definitely like a 4-piece for sure.
Yeah.
That's a good point, Josh.
And I agree. I think I like this album. I think it's a little rough. They haven't really refined their edges yet, but all of the DNA is there, and some of the later albums, even the next album, I think is a step up for them. I agree with you too. I really like Pretty Girls Dig Graves. That is one of my favorite songs off this album. And This Charming Man, was not really part of this album, but I saw they put it on like every album or every compilation since, because it actually came out before this album. And that's kind of one of their most famous songs, I would think. And other songs that I liked off of this were Reel Around the Fountain. I like that one as well. And the single was What Difference Does It Make, which I liked as well. But yeah, it's not like every song for me also did not really like resonate as much, but it's pretty consistently good. There's a couple songs on here that really, I don't know, didn't like reach the highs of some of the other songs, but it's not really bad per se. It just kind of didn't work for me. And I'm not one of those fans of the Smiths. Like, they're a band that really has kind of like a hardcore fan base, and people who are like into them, a lot of them are like super into them.
And Morrissey has his own subsection.
Yeah.
Which oddly includes like Mexican American fan base, which I find fascinating as well. He has a massive Mexican American fan base.
That was always an interest. I read an article about that once, and it was always so interesting how they would like dress up like him, and it was like a whole subculture. That's interesting. And so the point being is I'm not one of those fans, so I can kind of, I like them, but I don't necessarily love them in that way. But I really appreciate them, and I can see their influence for sure. And I will enjoy listening to some of these other albums and revisiting them as well.
So I should have been a bigger Smiths fan than what I actually ended up becoming, just because a lot of the stuff is right up my alley. And I was introduced to them. I remember my brother had like a CD laying around. It was like, who the heck, the Smiths? What a dumb name. Like, who are these guys, right? And so it wasn't until like about around 2000 when I burned one of those singles CDs from a friend that I got to know them. And knowing now, doing a little bit of research on this, while I was listening to this record, seeing that they only have 4 studio albums, and I looked at all the track listings, and there's so many Smith songs that I know that aren't on these albums, and I just go, this is why maybe they're known as the singles band, right? Because they have this rich catalog of great singles that were never made it to albums. So there was a lot of stuff on here that I didn't know, and for the most part, I liked it. I obviously, Hand in Glove is really good. This Charming Man. I love the beginning of Hand in Glove too. That's kind of I'm used to that. I think being the opening track of the singles, sounds like an opening track, and for it to kind of come in at track number 8 was a little weird for me.
Mm-hmm. I thought my buddy Jeff just doing Hand in Glove.
Yeah. And I love the guitar and what difference does it make? That's a very cool, kind of, there's some edge there. There's this, the Smiths don't have a ton of edge usually, but that's a song in which they do have it.
Well, they do lyrically, for sure. Like,
right, I'm talking musically. Yeah.
Edgelord quality to the lyrics, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. So, but a lot of the stuff that I didn't know, like I really did, I liked You've Got Everything Now. I thought that was a really great track. Pretty Girls Make Graves is fun too. Hand That Rocks the Cradle. Like Still Ill a lot. But there were some songs on here I do agree that didn't do as much for me. I'm with you, John. I am not a fan of falsetto Morrissey. And his falsetto on Miserable Lie ruins that song for me pretty much. I think it starts off pretty good, and I like how it starts off, it's like slow, and then it kind of builds this kind of like faster paced song, which I like, and then the second half of the song is just overrun by his falsetto that is not necessary. I mean, he's got some falsetto on, I think it's You've Got Everything Now, there's some falsetto there, but it's kind of peppered around. It's not the dominant vocaling style that he's using, so I'm okay with that a little bit, but it loses it for me once he starts going in that direction. I think also track 10, I Don't Owe You Anything, is a little bit of a slog for me. Suffer Little Children, the last song, a little bit of a slog too, but actually I started kind of getting a little hypnotized by the repetitive guitar sound that Johnny Marr has. So the more I listened to that, the more I was okay with it.
It's like a dirge, because lyrically it's very dark, and then it becomes to me like a dirge a little.
Which it makes sense to have the music go along with it like that. But I mean, for me, the Smiths, Morrissey's voice is not even maybe the third most appealing aspect of the Smiths, because to me it's absolutely the guitar and it's absolutely the bass. John, I agree with you. Maybe the drums, maybe I don't appreciate them as much, but who's the bass player? I don't even know who the other two guys are.
Andy Rourke is the
bass
player.
Andy Rourke's bass
is the drummer, yeah.
Okay, so I love the bass play. Like it's very melodic. It's fast paced. It does interesting things like the classic song "What There Is a Light That Never Dies Out." That's the bass part, and that is fantastic on both the verses and the chorus. And it's just, I like how it's front and center here. I like how it takes a lot of the melody. Johnny Marr's guitar a lot of times sometimes is more of the rhythm, and the bass kind of takes the more of the melodic part at times, not all the time. But to me, those two guys are what is the most appealing aspect of the Smiths for me. I don't mind Morrissey's voice for the most part. I think I think it's kind of funny at times, and I think it suits this music pretty well. Like, and the contrast is pretty interesting. But it's people love Morrissey's voice. I'm like Luke. I'm fine on it. I don't love it, nor do I hate it. I think
some people
unique.
love his voice, and some people love like his lyrics and like the witticisms, right?
Yeah.
And some people like the whole package. I think there's layers, right?
Right. So, and I think I appreciate all those things. But what gets me hooked with these guys is the 1-2 punch of the guitar and the bass. Love the guitar, and the Johnny Marr's he's got great chops, and the bass is just really impressive as well. So it's got a little inconsistency with it, but I think the better tracks far outweigh the weaker tracks for me. I really only saw two true tracks I was like on, maybe 2 or 3, but the rest I was pretty much sold on. So I'm a thumbs up on this, and I don't know. I guess I get kind of annoyed by these acts, and mostly British acts, that let's do all these singles, and then let's like do an album, and then let's do all these compilations. And I don't know, I like having sequential kind of like these are the albums, these are the full ideas that they put out as it was meant to be. There's not a US version and a UK version. I'm getting a little tired of that. But whatever, the music's still out there, and you can still it is. I might have had more of an issue with it if I had to go out and buy the records and then be missed, and then I had to go buy the singles as well. But now everything's on Spotify, and I can make a playlist, and it doesn't matter exactly. So
also the Beatles did that, I'd like to point out.
The Beatles did do that, exactly. But at least their albums were like, they had a ton of albums, and they were all awesome. And so and then they just released Past Masters in the late 80s, so they were basically 2 extra albums that they came out with, so I didn't have to worry about that as much with them.
Okay.
But
no, man, you got 3 more albums, and let's reserve judgment until you hear some of those. So
it's fair enough.
Yeah.
But but I'm a thumbs up on this. I definitely like the Smiths.
Yeah, and it becomes the lyricism becomes a lot funnier later. There's a few moments of funniness here, like most notably, there's a couple, right? But this is a much more serious, darker album, and I mean they always kind of go into those areas, but I would say the themes of this album are sort of like dark tales of human nature, and then of course like ambiguous sexuality would be two things that come up quite a bit. While those never go away in the Smith stuff, there is I find a lot more humor in the lyrics that comes later, that only begins to trickle in a little bit here, at different times. So I do want to point out, there's a little bit on, Reel Around the Fountain that's kind of funny. Like, I dreamed about you last night and I fell out of bed twice, that kind of just small things like that kind of made me, take me to the haven of your bed was something you never said. 2 lumps, please, makes me laugh always too. Stuff. So like small things like that, right? But a lot more that's coming later. So I look at it as we, I think all have sort of said, it's a formative album. Yep. But it'll be interesting to do the whole compare and contrast across the run.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any final thoughts?
I'm just excited to hear more. Yeah. I'm glad we're 80s. It took forever to get to the Smiths, so here, let's do it.
I believe we do all 4, and I think we're also doing their compilation Louder Than Bombs, which, I mean, has basically an album's worth of singles that aren't on any other albums by itself. So that'll be,